In today's episode of Building Wealth Brick by Brick Through Real Estate, I am going to talk about the Tenant Representation Agreement. This is part of the representation series that I am presenting to you. We are dealing with approximately 6 different representation agreements. So today's episode concentrates on the tenant experience and what that representation agreement looks like and what's involved when the tenant signs such an agreement with a real estate brokerage firm. My name is Nico James Bach. I am the Condo Wiz and broker at Royal LePage Signature Realty in downtown Toronto. Before a tenant signs a representation agreement, this applies to all representation agreements. The tenant will be introduced to TRESA. TRESA is the new legislation. Phase 2 kicked in on December 1st, 2023. But they're now actually working on Phase 3. It's an important legislation. Changes that were brought about as a result of the consumer. The consumer wanted greater transparency, and TRESA goes the extra mile in providing that transparency so that everybody that's involved in a real estate transaction knows who is represented by whom and what documentation is required to complete a real estate transaction. The RECO Information Guide is a fundamental part of the TRESA legislation, and that is the guide that is introduced and presented to the tenant prior to entering into a representation agreement. The guide is divided into several sections. Before TRESA, we were under the Real Estate and Business Brokers Act, and the working with a realtor guide was basically just 1 page or perhaps 2 page, like a 2-page pamphlet. The RECO Information Guide is 11 pages long. It goes in greater detail as to what is agency, the different types of agency, and what consumers can expect when working with a real estate professional. The first part of the guide is working with a real estate agent, what that entails. The next section deals with the risks of representing yourself. Prior to TRESA, there was a category called customer. So the distinction between a customer and a client is that the customer is not owed fiduciary duties by the real estate company. They are, however, owed service, transparency, and assistance. That category no longer exists. Now you are either a client of a brokerage or you are an unrepresented individual. If you're unrepresented, you are responsible for providing all of the paperwork, the information, which presumably you would get from your legal representative, your lawyer. But that is completely up to you, and the agent is not providing you with advice or assistance. The agent, the designated representative of the agency, will provide you with information pertaining to the real property, but that's as far as it goes. So understanding the risks of representing yourself is a prominent section of the real estate information, the RECO Information Guide. Then it goes on to explain signing a contract. So these are the representation agreements that the consumer enters into. So there is buyer representation, seller representation. There is the unrepresented individual, as well as tenant representation, which is the subject of this podcast episode, and landlord representation. There is a complete explanation as to what makes up a contract. So I'll be going through the parts of the tenant representation contract. These major parts apply to all contracts. There also is a section that describes multiple representation. So that is a significant part of the RECO Information Guide, and it is present in all representation agreements. An explanation of what is multiple representation is important for consumers to understand. So that is described in this section of the guide. Then it goes on to explain how you, as a consumer, can launch a complaint if an issue arises with your real estate professional. There is a section outlining the steps that should be taken when you want to launch a complaint. That is the RECO guide, and as I mentioned before, it is incumbent upon the real estate professional to present the guide to you, to explain it, and to get your acknowledgement that you have received it. Obviously, everything that is contained in the guide is brought to your attention throughout the process. So it's not just a one-time explanation or presentation. It is part and parcel of the entire real estate process. Looking at specifically today at the Tenant Representation Agreement, we start at the top. It indicates that this is an agreement that is to be entered into between a tenant and a real estate professional, and it's to be in writing. And also, before any offer to lease or purchase is signed, the tenant representation agreement must be completed. The components of the tenant representation agreement are as follows. At the top, there is the name of the brokerage, because it's an agreement between a brokerage and the tenant, as well as the name of the designated representative of the brokerage. So the designated representative is the real estate professional at the brokerage who is representing the interests of the tenant. There are two types of representation. There is brokerage representation, and then there is designated representation. Brokerage representation means that all agents at the brokerage represent the interests of any client that signs representation agreement. Designated representation outlines or specifies the individual agent. My brokerage, Royal LePage Signature, by default uses designated representation. It's primarily to avoid having to enter into multiple representation agreements with all clients, which obviously requires the consent of the client. So this type of representation has been divided into two, so that it's clearly indicated who is representing whom. Next is the name of the tenant, as well as the tenant's address. All contracts have to have a start date and an expiry date. So that section is clearly indicated on this agreement. Also, the tenant has to acknowledge that if the time period of the agreement between a tenant and a brokerage is for an extended period of time, then the tenant must have the initials. There is also a property type. So each of these agreements have a specific property type. So it's not a blanket agreement that covers all property types unless those property types are listed in the agreement. So it's a fairly specific, either geographical area or property type, or property type. So that has to be indicated on the agreement. It cannot be sort of Canada-wide or all properties. So these specifics have to be pointed out on the agreement. Next, the tenant warrants that the tenant is not a party of or not a party to another representation agreement with any other registered real estate brokerage for the lease or purchase of a real property of the general description described above. So that's why that description is important, because if you are looking in different geographical areas, then yes, you can have representation agreements from different brokerages in those varying geographical locations, or for the different types of property. So this section indicates that, or it allows the tenant to acknowledge that for the specific type and location indicated in this particular agreement that the tenant is signing, they are not a party to a similar agreement with another brokerage. The next section, which is the second clause of the representation agreement, deals with commission. It's important to note that the agreement sets the structure for the commission to be paid to the real estate brokerage. In the case of a tenant, the general basically the general way of doing of setting up tenant negotiations or setting up tenant leases is to have the listing broker pay the commission. That also goes for purchases. So the listing brokerage of the real estate is usually the one that pays the commission. This clause indicates that what the actual percentage would be in the case of a lease. So it can either be 1 month or half a month or a percentage of the total lease. This clause specifies that the real estate broker, brokerage, and designated representative, what they are entitled to receive. Okay, so because of full transparency, all members of a representation agreement have to be aware of what the compensation is. So in a case of a buyer or a tenant, they see what the brokerage, the cooperating brokerage is entitled to receive. That amount is specified on this agreement, and it's the amount that is visible on the MLS system through the various brokerages. If there is a shortfall of the commission that the brokerage is entitled to receive, then this clause provides for the tenant to make up the shortfall. So if there is a shortfall, the general rule is that the cooperating brokerage would go after the listing brokerage for that shortfall. If that shortfall is not covered, then this indicates that the tenant would be responsible for that. So that needs to be explained to the tenant. It occurs very rarely, but there are circumstances in which there is no listing brokerage. So for example, if the tenant enters into or would like to lease a property that is not listed, then the tenant would assume the responsibility of compensating their broker representative for arranging that lease. So that is a clear indication that the tenant is fully responsible for that. In the case where there is a leased property, a property that is available for lease on the MLS system, so represented by a listing brokerage, then it's the listing brokerage company that offers the compensation for the cooperating broker. Representation is the next section, which is the third section, and it describes the relationship between the tenant and the brokerage. It also starts the discussion about multiple representation. So multiple representation is defined as a situation where there are two competing clients, competing for the interest in one property, and there is one agent representing both of their interests. They need to provide consent for that, and that is what is explained in this section. After that, there is a mention of a finder's fee, which is the sixth clause. And this clause provides consent in the event the brokerage or salesperson receives a finder's fee or other reward as part of the transaction. So as I mentioned before, the point is full transparency. That's the point of this whole new legislation. That the parties are aware of the remuneration that the brokerage receives. Consumer reports. The tenant is hereby notified that a consumer report containing credit and or personal information may be referred to in connection with this transaction. And then there's also the use and distribution of information. So the tenant will consent to the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information by the brokerage, obviously not security information, but personal information by the brokerage that relates to the real estate services provided by the brokerage to the tenant. The final section of the representation agreement is a section for the signatures. So it's the tenant or tenants that sign. And there's also a section for the designated representative. It's important to note that there is also a section for the declaration of insurance. Declaration of insurance is for the broker salesperson to complete and sign. That is proof or it is actually specifying that the real estate broker has insurance, errors of omission insurance, which is a requirement under the legislation. If you are listening to this podcast and don't have the ability to view what I am sharing, the various parts of the representation agreement, you can just click on the link at the bottom in the show notes, and that will take you to the YouTube video of this presentation, where you can take a look at the RECO Information Guide, the different sections, as well as the different sections of the representation agreement. That concludes this episode. All of my contact information is also in the show notes, and you can find me through my various social channels. Have you worked with our real estate representative for the arranging of a lease or purchase as a tenant? I would be interested to know what your experience was, so you can leave those if you are listening on Spotify. or on YouTube, you can leave those comments. Ciao, ciao.